The candle in Alina Whitmore's hand shook as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the east corridor. It was barely past midnight, her first night in Ashcombe Manor as its new Duchess, and she had already stumbled onto something she was never meant to hear. Two men stood in the shadow of the wine cellar entrance, their voices low but sharp with urgency. "The ball is in 11 days, one of them whispered. "If the shipment does not arrive by then, everything falls apart." "It will arrive," the other man said, "and when it does, no one in this house will know what hit them." Alina did not move. She barely breathed. She recognized neither voice, but something in the way they spoke, careful, clipped, rehearsed, told her this was not an ordinary household matter. She waited until their footsteps faded down the servants' stairwell before she allowed herself to exhale. She was 24 years old, married just 3 weeks earlier to Edmund Ashcombe, the Duke of Ravensworth, in a ceremony that had surprised half the county. Alina had grown up far from ballrooms and titles, the daughter of a shipping clerk in a coastal town, where she had spent her childhood watching cargo manifests, tracking numbers, and learning to read people before they ever opened their mouths. Her father used to say she had a mind built for patterns, the kind of mind that noticed when something did not add up long before anyone else did. No one at Ashcombe Manor knew this about her. To them, she was simply the girl the Duke had fallen for during a visit to the coast, a quiet young woman who blinked too much at dinner and never seemed to have anything clever to say. The staff exchanged glances behind her back. The visiting nobles smiled thin smiles when they thought she could not see. Even Edmund's own mother, who had passed the year before, would have raised an eyebrow at the match, or so the older servants whispered when they believed Alina was out of earshot. Alina let them believe what they wanted. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was not a weakness, it was a shield. She made her way back to her chambers that night without a sound, her mind already working through what she had heard. A shipment. 11 days. The exact date of the grand ball, the largest social event Ashcombe Manor would host all year, an event that would bring nearly 300 guests, including foreign dignitaries, rival noble families, and members of the royal court itself. The next morning, Alina sat at the long breakfast table across from Edmund, who was reading a letter from his estate manager with a furrowed brow. He was a kind man, thoughtful in ways his title did not require him to be, but he was also a man consumed by duty, and duty at Ashcombe Manor meant constant demands on his attention. Alina watched him for a moment before speaking. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "Barely," Edmund admitted, setting the letter down. "The wine merchant is threatening to cancel our order unless we pay him early. Ridiculous, given how long our family has done business with him." "Which merchant?" Alina asked, sipping her tea. "Prout and Sons. Gerald Prout handles the account personally now that his father has retired." Alina filed the name away without reacting. She had learned that reactions were currency, and she preferred to spend hers carefully. Over the following days, Alina began to move through Ashcombe Manor in a way that no one noticed, because no one thought to notice her at all. She walked the kitchens in the mornings, greeting the cooks and the scullery maids by name, asking small questions about their work, their families, their days. She sat with the household ledgers in the evenings, not because anyone asked her to, but because Edmund had mentioned once that the accounts were growing complicated, and complications were exactly the sort of thing Alina's mind could not leave alone. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret Doyle, watched Alina's quiet habits with a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. Margaret had served 3 generations of Ashcombe dukes and duchesses, and she had never seen a lady of the house take such interest in flower deliveries and coal invoices. "Most duchesses would rather choose gown fabric than read a ledger," Margaret said one evening, finding Alina bent over a stack of papers by candlelight. "I like understanding how things work," Alina replied simply. "It helps me feel less like a stranger here." Margaret said nothing, but she noticed the way Aliner's finger paused over certain lines in the accounts, the way her brow tightened slightly at a delivery date that did not match an invoice date. She noticed, and she did not forget it. By the 5th day, Aliner had learned 3 things that troubled her. First, that Prout and Sons had been supplying wine and spirits to Ashcombe Manor for nearly 20 years without incident, until 3 months ago, when Gerald Prout took over the family business from his aging father. Second, that since Gerald's takeover, at least 2 other noble households in the county had reported strange irregularities with deliveries, including one family who quietly dismissed their wine steward after a shipment arrived with broken seals. Third, and most troubling of all, that the 2 men she had overheard in the corridor on her first night bore no resemblance to any of the household staff she had since come to know by face and voice. She did not go to Edmund with half-formed suspicions. She had learned that much from her father as well, that a theory without evidence was only gossip wearing a fancier coat. Instead, she kept watching, kept listening, kept turning the pieces over in her mind, while the rest of Ashcombe Manor prepared for the biggest night of the social calendar. The preparations for the grand ball consumed the household in a way Aliner had never witnessed before. Florists arrived with cart after cart of imported blooms. Musicians rehearsed in the East Hall until their fingers ached. Seamstresses worked through the night finishing gowns for the Duke's extended family. Every hallway buzzed with a kind of controlled chaos that made it easy for Aliner to move unnoticed, slipping between rooms, listening at doors, watching who came and went through the service entrances. It was during one of these quiet observations that she first noticed Alice Turner, a young kitchen maid no older than 18, standing near the delivery yard with an expression of open worry on her face. Aliner approached her gently, the way she approached all the staff, without the weight of her title pressing down on the conversation. "Is something troubling you, Alice?" Aliner asked. Alice startled, nearly dropping the basket of onions she carried. "Oh, Your Grace, I didn't see you there." "Please, there's no need to be nervous. I only asked because you looked worried." Alice hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "It's nothing, Your Grace. Only the wine delivery last week seemed strange. The crates were heavier than usual, and one of the men who brought them wasn't from Prout's usual crew. I've seen the regular delivery boys for years. This one was new, and he wouldn't meet my eyes." Aliner kept her expression calm, though her pulse quickened. "Did you mention this to anyone?" "I told Mr. Voss, the butler, but he said I was imagining things, that new hires happen all the time." Alice bit her lip. "But it felt wrong, Your Grace. I can't explain it better than that." "You don't need to explain it better," Aliner said gently. "You noticed something, that matters. Thank you for telling me." Alice looked surprised, as though she had expected to be dismissed the way Henry Voss had dismissed her. Aliner made a mental note of the girl's sharp eyes and her willingness to speak up, even when she doubted herself. In a house full of people who saw Aliner as decorative and unimportant, she was quietly building a small circle of allies who saw things others missed, people the nobility never bothered to ask. That evening, Aliner found an excuse to visit the wine cellar herself, carrying a lantern and telling the night guard she wished to select bottles for a private dinner. The guard, a broad-shouldered young man named Peter Lang, escorted her without question, though his eyes followed her curiously as she moved slowly along the racks, running her fingers over dust and labels, counting crates in the dim light. She found what she was looking for near the back of the cellar, a stack of crates pushed slightly apart from the rest, their wood newer, their markings slightly different from the older Prout and Sons stock. She did not open them. She was careful never to disturb anything that might alert whoever had placed them there. But she memorized their position, their number. And the faint chemical smell that clung to the wood, something sharper and less pleasant than wine. "Everything satisfactory, Your Grace?" Peter asked as she turned to leave. "Quite satisfactory," Aliner said, offering him a small, genuine smile. "Tell me, Peter, how long have you served as night guard here?" 2 years, Your Grace. And in that time, have deliveries always come through the main gate, checked by the household steward? Peter frowned slightly, considering the question. Mostly, yes, though lately some crates come through the side entrance near the stables. Mr. Voss said it was to save time during the ball preparations. Elinor filed this away as well, another small crack in the pattern, another loose thread pulling at the edges of what should have been an ordinary household routine. She thanked Peter and returned to her chambers, her mind racing long after the candles had burned low. She was beginning to understand the shape of something dangerous, though its full picture remained hidden in shadow. Gerald Prout had taken control of a family business under financial strain, according to what she had overheard from Edmund's conversations with his estate manager. New, unfamiliar men were delivering goods through side entrances instead of the main gate. Crates with a strange chemical smell were being hidden in the depths of the wine cellar, separate from the regular stock. And in 11 days, now shrinking to 6, the grand ball would fill Ashcombe Manor with the very people whose good opinion, and whose safety, mattered more than anything else to the Ashcombe family's standing. Elinor did not yet know what the crates contained or what purpose they served. She only knew, with the same instinct that had once told her father when a cargo manifest had been quietly altered to hide stolen goods, that something was deeply wrong, and that the people around her, distracted by flowers and gowns and orchestra rehearsals, had no idea how close danger stood to their door. She thought of the 2 men in the corridor, their whispered words about a shipment that would arrive before the ball, about how no one in the house would know what hit them. She thought of Alice's frightened eyes, of the strange delivery men who would not meet the young maid's gaze. She thought of the crates in the cellar, hidden apart from the rest, and the chemical smell that did not belong in a house full of fine wine. Whatever was coming, Elinor understood that she could not simply wait for someone else to notice it. The nobles at Ashcombe Manor had already decided who she was, a quiet girl from a coastal town, pleasant enough but unremarkable, someone to be tolerated rather than trusted. They would not listen to vague suspicions from a duchess they had already dismissed as dull. If she wanted to stop whatever was coming, she would have to gather proof herself, quietly, carefully, the way she had been taught to read a manifest for the lie hidden inside its numbers. And she would have to do it before the last carriage arrived at Ashcombe Manor's grand entrance, before the orchestra played its first note, before 300 unsuspecting guests filled a house that someone, for reasons still unknown to her, seemed determined to turn into a trap. She closed her eyes that night with the image of those hidden crates burned into her memory, and for the first time since her wedding day, Elinor Whitmore felt the true weight of the title she now carried. Not the weight of gowns or jewels or the expectations of noble society, but the weight of knowing something others did not, and the responsibility that came with it. 6 days remained until the grand ball. Elinor intended to use every single one of them. By morning, Elinor had already decided on her first move. She could not confront Gerald Prout directly, not without proof, and she could not tell Edmund yet either, not while her evidence was still a collection of odd smells and mismatched crates rather than something solid enough to act upon. So she did what she had always done best. She watched, and she waited, and she let people underestimate her while she quietly gathered what she needed. She began with the ledgers again, but this time she was not looking for irregularities in the accounts of Ashcombe Manor alone. She wrote a short letter, addressed to her father's old friend, a man named Oliver Marsh who worked in the shipping registry office 2 counties away, a man who had taught her to read manifests before she could properly read novels. She asked him, in careful and vague language, whether he had heard anything about Prout and Sons, whether their trade had grown or shrunk in recent months, and whether any unusual cargo had passed through the registry under that name. She sent the letter with the Morning Post, sealed with wax and marked for Oliver's eyes alone, and then she turned her attention back to the manor, where preparations for the ball had reached a fever pitch. Long tables were carried into the grand hall. Chandeliers were lowered and cleaned, their crystal pieces polished until they threw rainbows across the marble floor. The head chef, a proud man named Frederick Coombe, argued loudly with two assistants over the seating arrangement for the dessert course, as though the fate of the household depended on where the sugared fruit would sit. In the middle of this chaos, Alina found Alice again, this time helping to fold linens in a small side room away from the noise. She closed the door gently behind her. "I have a favor to ask," Alina said, keeping her voice low. "But I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you must stay between us." Alice set down the linen in her hands, her eyes wide but steady. "Of course, Your Grace." "The delivery man you saw, the one who avoided your eyes, would you recognize him again if you saw him?" "I think so, yes. He had a scar just above his left eyebrow and he walked with a slight limp, like his boot didn't fit right." Alina nodded slowly. A scar and a limp were small details, but small details were often the difference between a vague suspicion and a real lead. "If you ever see him again, anywhere on the grounds, I want you to find me immediately. Not Mr. Voss, me." "Yes, Your Grace," Alice said, and then after a pause she added, "May I ask why?" Alina considered how much to share. She had learned that trust, once given carelessly, could not be taken back, but trust withheld too tightly accomplished nothing either. "I believe something is being hidden in this house, something that could put everyone at the ball in danger. I don't yet know what or why, but I intend to find out before it's too late." Alice's face paled slightly, but she did not flinch. "What can I do to help?" "Keep your eyes open, the way you already have been. And if anyone asks why you're spending time near me, tell them I've taken an interest in training a new lady's maid. No one will question that." The two of them worked out a simple plan, a way for Alice to move through the house without suspicion, checking on deliveries, listening near the kitchens and the stable yard where servants gossiped freely, believing themselves unheard by anyone who mattered. It was a small thing, a maid and a duchess working quietly together, but Alina had learned that the people who moved through a house unnoticed often knew far more about its secrets than the people who sat at the head of its table. 2 days later, a response arrived from Oliver Marsh, and Alina read it 3 times before she allowed herself to fully process what it said. Prout and Sons, according to the shipping registry, had taken on significant debt over the past year, debt that Gerald Prout's father had never carried in the decades before him. More troubling still, the registry showed a recent cargo manifest for Prout and Sons that listed a shipment of industrial cleaning compounds, bound for a warehouse near the coast, a shipment that had mysteriously vanished from the registry's tracking system 3 weeks ago, never confirmed as delivered to its listed destination. Industrial cleaning compounds made little sense for a wine and spirits merchant. Alina sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, turning the words over in her mind, searching for an innocent explanation, and finding none that satisfied her instincts. She needed to see inside those crates. That night she waited until the manor had settled into its late hours, when even the busiest preparations for the ball had paused for a few hours of rest. She dressed simply, in a dark wool dress with no jewelry to catch the light, and made her way down to the wine cellar with a small lantern shielded by a cloth to soften its glow. She had told Peter Lang earlier that evening, in casual conversation, that she sometimes struggled to sleep and might walk the halls at odd hours. He had accepted this without question. The way he accepted most things Alina said, with a polite nod and no further curiosity. The cellar was cold and silent, the racks of wine bottles casting long shadows against the stone walls. Alina moved carefully to the back corner where she had found the unfamiliar crates days before. They were still there, 6 of them, stacked too high, their wood pale and unmarked by the years of dust that coated the older stock around them. She knelt beside the nearest crate and examined its edges. The lid had been nailed shut, but not tightly, and with careful, patient effort, using a small iron tool she had taken from the kitchen earlier that day, She was able to loosen one corner enough to see inside without disturbing the crate's overall appearance. Inside, nestled in straw packing, were rows of glass bottles unlike any wine bottle she had ever seen. They were squat and thick-walled, sealed with wax at the neck, and filled with a pale amber liquid that gave off the same sharp chemical smell she had noticed before, stronger now that she was close to it. There were no labels, no markings of any kind, nothing to indicate what the liquid was or where it had truly come from. Eleanor's mind raced through everything she knew. Industrial cleaning compounds did not need to be smuggled into a wine cellar in unmarked bottles disguised among crates of vintage spirits. Whatever these bottles held, someone had gone to significant trouble to hide their true nature, and someone had gone to even greater trouble to ensure they arrived inside Ashcombe Manor before the largest gathering of nobility the estate would host all year. She carefully resealed the crate, taking care to leave everything exactly as she had found it, and made her way back upstairs with her heart pounding harder than she had allowed it to in days. She understood now that this was no longer a matter of financial trickery or a merchant padding his profits with questionable goods. This felt like something far more dangerous, something aimed not at Ashcombe Manor's ledgers, but at the people who would soon fill its halls. The next morning, Eleanor requested a private audience with Edmund before his usual round of estate business began. She chose her words carefully, aware that presenting half-formed suspicions without evidence might see her dismissed as an anxious new bride overwhelmed by her responsibilities, exactly the kind of reputation she had spent weeks quietly working to avoid. "Edmund," she began, once they were alone in his study, "I need to speak with you about the wine cellar." He looked up from his correspondence, mild curiosity in his expression. "The wine cellar, has something gone missing?" "Not missing," Eleanor said. Added, "There are crates in the back of the cellar that do not belong to our usual stock. I opened one last night and found bottles filled with an unmarked liquid that smells nothing like wine. I believe they may have arrived through Prout and Sons, hidden among the deliveries meant for the ball." Edmund's expression shifted slowly from curiosity to concern. "You opened the crates yourself. Eleanor, if something dangerous is inside them." "I was careful," she said gently, "but I need you to trust me on this. Something is wrong, and I don't believe it's a coincidence that it's arriving just before 300 guests fill this house." Edmund set down his pen entirely now, giving her his full attention in a way he rarely had time for amid the chaos of preparations. "What do you propose we do?" "Nothing that draws attention yet," Eleanor said. "If Gerald Prout or whoever is behind this realizes we suspect them, they may simply change their plan, and we'll lose any chance of understanding what that plan truly is. I want to keep watching. I want to know who delivers to the side entrance, who receives them, and where the rest of these crates might be hidden throughout the house. Only once we understand the full shape of this can we act without risking everyone's safety." Edmund studied his wife for a long moment, and Eleanor watched something change in his expression, a dawning recognition that the woman he had married, whom the household had quietly written off as sweet but unremarkable, possessed a mind far sharper than any of them had given her credit for. "You've been investigating this on your own," he said slowly. "For how long?" "Since my first night here," Eleanor admitted. "I overheard two men speaking near the cellar entrance. I didn't want to trouble you with vague suspicions until I had something solid to bring you." Edmund's expression softened, though the concern in his eyes did not fade. "Eleanor, if there is truly danger in this house, I would rather hear vague suspicions 10 times over than have you walking through cellars alone at midnight, opening crates that might hold anything at all." "I understand," she said, "but I also understand that if we bring in guards or estate officials too quickly, whoever planned this will simply vanish and try again another way, perhaps somewhere we won't be watching as closely. I would rather know exactly what we're facing before we move." After a long silence, Edmund nodded, though reluctance still lingered in the set of his jaw. "Then we do this together. No more midnight visits to the cellar without me knowing at the very least, and we bring Peter Lang into confidence. He is loyal, and he moves through this house at hours when most of the staff are asleep. He may see things we cannot." Alina agreed, relieved to finally share the weight of what she carried, though she knew the most difficult work still lay ahead. Over the following 2 days, working quietly with Edmund, Peter, and Alice, a clearer picture began to emerge. Peter confirmed that deliveries through the side entrance near the stables had increased significantly in the past week, always arriving late at night, always handled by the same small group of men, none of whom matched the faces of Prout and Son's usual delivery crew. Alice, moving unnoticed through the kitchens and servant halls, overheard 2 of the temporary staff hired for the ball, whispering about a signal, a specific time during the evening's festivities when something was meant to happen, though she could not make out further details before they noticed her nearby and fell silent. Alina began to suspect that the crates in the cellar were not the only ones hidden throughout the house. She began quietly mapping the manor in her mind, room by room, thinking not as a duchess planning a party, but as her father once had, tracing the path a dangerous cargo might take once it reached its destination, and where within that destination it might be positioned to cause the greatest possible harm. 4 days remained until the grand ball, and Alina understood now that whatever was coming had been planned with far more care and patience than anyone at Ashcombe Manor had realized. The question that kept her awake long into the night was no longer simply what the crates contained, but who among the many faces preparing for that grand and glittering evening intended to see it through, and how close they already stood to succeeding. On the 3rd day, Alina decided it was time to see Gerald Prout with her own eyes. She could not simply arrive at his warehouse and demand answers, not without revealing everything she had learned and risking whatever plan he had set in motion. Instead, she arranged, through Edmund, a seemingly ordinary visit, a courtesy call from the Duke and Duchess to discuss final arrangements for the wine service at the ball. Gerald could hardly refuse a personal visit from the family, whose business had sustained his father for decades. Prout and Sons operated out of a large stone warehouse near the harbor, its wide doors opening onto a courtyard where barrels and crates were loaded and unloaded throughout the day. When Alina and Edmund arrived by carriage, Gerald himself came out to greet them, a tall man in his early 30s with a carefully trimmed beard and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly to each of them in turn. "What an honor. I hope everything is satisfactory for the coming celebration." "We wanted to see the operation firsthand," Edmund said smoothly, exactly as Alina had suggested he say. "It has been years since anyone from our family visited in person. My father always spoke well of yours." "My father built this business on trust," Gerald said, his tone practiced and warm. "I intend to honor that legacy." Alina watched him carefully as he spoke, noting the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the warehouse doors whenever a worker passed too close, the way his hands, folded politely in front of him, betrayed a faint tremor he seemed to be working hard to control. She had spent years learning to read the small signs people gave away without meaning to, the tells that separated confidence from performance. "Might we see where the shipments are prepared?" Alina asked, her voice light and curious, the tone of a new duchess simply interested in the workings of her household suppliers. "I find it fascinating how everything comes together for an event of this size." A flicker of something crossed Gerald's face, gone almost before Alina could name it, but she recognized it nonetheless. It was the look of a man calculating quickly, weighing the risk of refusal against the risk of exposure. "Of course," he said finally, gesturing toward the warehouse, "though I'm afraid much of it will look rather dull to your grace, crates and barrels, nothing more." He led them through the main floor, past rows of wine barrels stacked according to vintage, past workers who paused their labor to bow respectfully as the Duke and Duchess passed. Alina took in every detail, The layout of the warehouse, the position of the loading doors, the smaller side room near the back where two men stood guard beside a door that Gerald did not offer to open, and toward which he subtly steered their path away from, as though hoping neither of his guests would notice its presence at all. "What's kept in that room?" Elinor asked, stopping just long enough to make the question feel natural rather than pointed. "Overflow storage," Gerald said quickly. "Nothing of interest, old furniture, broken barrels awaiting repair." Elinor smiled and let the matter drop, though she memorized the position of that door, the two guards who stood beside it, and the particular way Gerald's voice had tightened when he answered. She had learned enough for one visit. Pushing further would only raise his suspicion that the Duchess he had dismissed as harmlessly curious understood far more than she let on. On the carriage ride home, Edmund turned to her with a troubled expression. "You saw the same thing I did, that room." "I did," Elinor said, "and the guards beside it. Men do not post guards over broken furniture." "What do we do now?" Elinor considered the question carefully. "We need to know what's truly happening on the night of the ball, not just what's hidden in that warehouse or in our own cellar. If Gerald Prout is behind this, he is not acting alone. Someone hired those men who deliver through our side entrance. Someone gave them a signal, a specific time, as Alice overheard. We need to know who benefits from chaos at the largest gathering of nobility in the county." That evening, Elinor sat with Edmund in his study, and together they worked through the guest list for the grand ball, searching for anyone whose presence, or whose absence, might explain a motive strong enough to risk such an elaborate and dangerous scheme. They considered rival noble families with old grudges against the Ashcombe name. They considered political factions who might wish to embarrass the Duke in front of visiting dignitaries, including Count Aldrich Novak, a foreign diplomat whose presence at the ball had been arranged to strengthen a delicate trade agreement between their two nations. It was Edmund who first noticed the pattern that had been sitting quietly in front of them. "Prout and Sons took on significant debt in the past year," you said. "What if Gerald was not acting out of personal malice at all, but because someone paid him to?" Elinor sat up straighter. Someone who wanted chaos at this particular ball, on this particular night, with these particular guests in attendance. They returned to the guest list with fresh eyes, and this time, a name caught Elinor's attention that she had passed over before without much thought. Lady Beatrice Fenwick, a noblewoman from a family whose fortunes had declined sharply in recent years, largely due to a series of failed trade negotiations that had favored the Ashcombe family's interests over her own. Beatrice had attended countless events at Ashcombe Manor over the years, always polite, always gracious, always seemingly content to remain in the Duke's social circle, despite the quiet resentment that simmered beneath her family's declining fortunes. "Beatrice Fenwick's family lost the northern trade routes to us 3 years ago," Edmund said slowly, memory sharpening as he spoke. "My father secured the agreement that her father had spent a decade pursuing. It nearly ruined them." Elinor felt the pieces sliding into place with the cold clarity of a manifest finally balancing after hours of confusion. If something happened at this ball, something that embarrassed the Ashcombe family in front of Count Novak and the other dignitaries, it could unravel this new trade agreement entirely. And if the agreement fails, who would benefit most? "Anyone positioned to offer the Count an alternative partnership," Edmund said grimly. "Beatrice's family has been quietly courting trade interests in the same region for the past year. I'd heard rumors, but I never imagined she would go this far." They had no definitive proof, not yet, only a chain of reasoning built from small observations and careful deduction. But Elinor trusted the pattern the same way she trusted numbers on a page. It was time to bring Peter Lang and Alice fully into the plan, and it was time to move more quickly than they had before, because only 3 days now remained until the grand ball would open its doors to 300 unsuspecting guests. Alina met with Peter and Alice together that night in the small side room where Alice had once folded linens, the same room that had become their quiet headquarters over the past week. She laid out everything they had learned: the crates in the cellar, the hidden room at Prout's warehouse, the possible connection to Lady Beatrice Fenwick, and the collapsing trade agreement with Count Novik. "We need eyes on every entrance during the ball," Alina said. "Peter, I want you coordinating with the household guards, but quietly. No one outside this room should know we suspect anything until we're certain. Alice, I need you watching the kitchen and service halls, since that's where any signal or coordination between the delivery men and their contact inside would most likely pass unnoticed." "And you, Your Grace," Peter asked, "what will you be doing?" "I'll be doing what I do best," Alina said. "Watching the room, reading the guests, and staying close enough to Lady Beatrice Fenwick to see if her behavior gives anything away before the night is done." The following day brought an unexpected complication. Word arrived that Gerald Prout himself had requested a personal audience with Edmund, insisting on delivering the final wine shipment in person rather than through his usual delivery crew. A request that struck both Alina and Edmund as deeply suspicious given everything they had recently learned. If Gerald intended to personally oversee the delivery, it likely meant the final and most dangerous portion of whatever plan had been set in motion was drawing near. Alina spent that evening back in the cellar, this time with Edmund and Peter accompanying her, examining the crates more carefully than she had dared to on her own. Using tools borrowed quietly from the estate's carpenter, they opened one of the crates fully, revealing not just the unmarked bottles Alina had seen before, but a small mechanism nestled among the straw packing, a device none of them fully understood, wired with a thin cord that connected several of the bottles together in a chain. Peter, who had served briefly with the Royal Engineers before returning home to work as a guard, studied the mechanism with a grim expression. "This isn't cleaning fluid, Your Grace. This is designed to ignite. If enough of these bottles were placed strategically throughout a room, and this mechanism triggered at the right moment, it could cause significant damage. Fire, smoke, panic. Enough to cause chaos in a crowded ballroom, especially if triggered during a moment when everyone was gathered closely together." Alina felt a cold weight settle in her chest, though her mind remained clear and focused. This was no longer a theory built from suspicious crates and overheard whispers. This was a genuine threat aimed directly at the heart of the grand ball, timed, as Alice had overheard, for a specific moment during the evening's festivities, likely when the largest number of guests, including Count Novik and his delegation, would be gathered in one place. "We cannot simply remove the crates," Edmund said, thinking quickly. "If Gerald or whoever is coordinating this notices they're missing, they may find another way to carry out the plan, one we won't see coming. Then we let them believe everything is proceeding as planned," Alina said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We let the final shipment arrive. We let Gerald believe his plan is intact, and we prepare ourselves to stop it at the exact moment it's meant to happen, not before, when we might miss something crucial, and not after, when it will be too late." It was a dangerous strategy, one that required patience and precision in equal measure, but Alina understood that acting too soon would only warn their enemies without stopping them, while acting too late could mean disaster for everyone gathered beneath Ashcombe Manor's grand chandeliers. Over the following 2 days, working in careful secrecy with Edmund, Peter, and Alice, Alina mapped out every detail of the plan that would unfold on the night of the ball, memorizing the position of every hidden crate discovered so far, coordinating with a small trusted group of household guards who would watch the room without drawing attention, and preparing herself, quietly and completely, for the moment when the quiet Duchess, everyone had underestimated, would need to become something far more than anyone at Ashcombe Manor had ever imagined her to be. 2 days remained until the grand ball. Somewhere beyond the manor's walls, Gerald Prout was preparing his final shipment, and somewhere among the invitations already sent and accepted, Lady Beatrice Fenwick was preparing to attend an event she hoped would end in disaster for the family that had cost her everything. Alina did not yet know exactly how the night would unfold, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she would be ready when it did. The night of the grand ball arrived wrapped in golden light, and the sound of violins drifting through open windows. Carriages lined the long drive up to Ashcombe Manor, each one delivering guests dressed in silk and jewels, their laughter and chatter filling the courtyard as footmen rushed to greet them. From the outside, it looked exactly as every grand ball before it had looked, glittering, joyful, effortless. Only a handful of people within those walls knew how carefully that appearance had been constructed to hide the danger waiting beneath it. Alina stood at the top of the grand staircase beside Edmund, dressed in a deep blue gown that caught the candlelight with every movement, greeting guests, as they arrived with the same quiet composure she had carried since her first night at Ashcombe Manor. No one watching her smile and incline her head to each new arrival would have guessed that her mind was mapping the room with the precision of a general preparing for battle, tracking the position of every guard disguised among the household staff, counting the minutes until the moment Alice had overheard whispered between two strangers days before. Gerald Prout arrived personally with the final wine delivery just as the first guests were being seated for the evening's opening toast, exactly as he had requested. Alina watched from across the entrance hall as he directed two unfamiliar men carrying the last of the crates toward the cellar stairs, his expression carefully composed into the same practiced warmth he had shown during their visit to his warehouse days before. Peter Lang, positioned nearby in the uniform of an ordinary household guard, gave Alina the smallest nod as the crates passed, confirming what she already suspected. This was the final piece falling into place. The ballroom itself had been transformed into something out of a dream, its high ceilings draped with silk ribbons, its floor polished to a mirror shine beneath the light of 1,000 candles. Count Aldrich Novick and his delegation arrived shortly after the wine, greeted personally by Edmund with the warmth due to a guest whose goodwill mattered greatly to the future of the Ashcombe family's standing. Alina watched Lady Beatrice Fenwick arrive soon after, elegant in emerald green, greeting old acquaintances, with a smile so genuine that Alina might have doubted every suspicion she carried. Had she not learned days ago exactly how much practice went into performances like this one? As the evening progressed, Alina moved through the crowd with careful purpose, exchanging polite conversation while never losing track of the small signals passing between Peter's guards stationed at each entrance. Alice slipped between the kitchen and the ballroom carrying trays of refreshments, her sharp eyes scanning every face among the temporary staff hired for the night, searching for the scarred man with the ill-fitting boot she had described days before. It was nearly an hour into the evening, during a lull between the opening toasts and the first dance, when Alice found Alina near the edge of the ballroom and pressed a folded napkin into her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him, Your Grace, near the west entrance by the smaller drawing room. He was speaking with one of the footmen, the new one who started only this week." Alina's pulse quickened, though her expression remained perfectly calm. "Thank you, Alice. Find Peter and tell him what you told me," quietly. Alina made her way toward the west entrance with unhurried steps, smiling and nodding to guests along the way, giving no outward sign of the urgency building beneath her composed exterior. The smaller drawing room sat just beyond the main ballroom, connected by a narrow corridor rarely used during large events, exactly the kind of overlooked space where something dangerous might be quietly prepared without drawing attention. She found the door slightly ajar, and through the gap, saw a young footman kneeling beside an ornate cabinet near the fireplace, carefully arranging several of the unmarked bottles Alina recognized instantly from the wine cellar, connecting them with the same thin cord Peter had identified days before. The scarred man Alice had described stood watch near the window, glancing occasionally toward the corridor. Alina did not hesitate, though every instinct urged caution. She stepped back from the door and moved quickly but quietly toward the ballroom, finding Peter near the refreshment table exactly where Alice had promised he would be. "West drawing room," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Two men and the device is already being placed. We don't have much time." Peter's expression hardened into focus. How many guards can I trust to move without drawing attention? "Enough," Elinor said. "But I need to keep Lady Beatrice occupied. If she realizes her plan has been discovered before we've stopped it, she may find another way to cause chaos or warn her associates before we can act." Elinor found Lady Beatrice near the dance floor, engaged in light conversation with two other noblewomen, and approached with the easy confidence of a duchess simply seeking company among her guests. "Lady Beatrice, might I steal you for a moment? I've been meaning to ask your opinion on the seating arrangement for the northern delegation. Edmund tells me you have far more experience with these diplomatic matters than I do." It was a flimsy excuse, but flattery rarely failed to hold someone's attention, and Beatrice, perhaps eager to appear indispensable to the very family whose downfall she had quietly engineered, allowed herself to be led toward a quiet corner of the room, drawn into a conversation about protocol and precedents that Elinor stretched out with careful, deliberate patience, watching Beatrice's composure for any sign that she sensed something had gone wrong elsewhere in the house. Meanwhile, Peter moved through the corridor toward the west drawing room with three trusted guards disguised among the evening's household staff. They entered swiftly and quietly, catching the footman and the scarred man before either could react to the sudden presence of armed men in household uniform. The footman, young and clearly overwhelmed by the situation he had been drawn into, offered no resistance and quickly confirmed, in a shaking voice, that he had been paid a substantial sum by an intermediary to place the bottles and trigger the mechanism at a signal that was meant to come within the hour, timed to the moment when the largest gathering of guests would crowd into the ballroom for the evening's main dance. The scarred man proved less cooperative, attempting to reach for the mechanism's trigger even as Peter's guards closed in around him. But Peter, drawing on the discipline of his years with the Royal Engineers, moved quickly to disable the device before it could be activated, carefully cutting the thin cord that connected the bottles and rendering the mechanism harmless with steady, practiced hands. Within the ballroom, the evening continued exactly as it should have, the orchestra beginning the first dance, guests moving gracefully across the polished floor, entirely unaware of how close disaster had come to unfolding in the room just beyond their laughter and music. Elinor, still engaged in careful conversation with Lady Beatrice, felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease when she caught the smallest signal from Peter across the room, a subtle touch to his collar that they had agreed upon earlier that evening, confirming that the threat had been neutralized. But Elinor was not finished. She had promised herself that she would not simply stop the immediate danger and allow Lady Beatrice to walk away untouched, free to plan another attempt in the future. She excused herself from their conversation and found Edmund near the head of the ballroom, quietly informing him that the device had been disabled and that the two men responsible were now in custody. "And Beatrice?" Edmund asked quietly, his eyes drifting toward the noblewoman still standing near the dance floor, unaware that her plan had already unraveled. "We need proof that connects her directly, not just to Gerald Prout, but to the men who placed the device tonight," Elinor said. "The footman confirmed he was paid through an intermediary. If we can find that connection, we can ensure she faces real consequences, not simply suspicion that she'll deny with practiced ease." Edmund nodded, understanding immediately. "Gerald is still in the house, overseeing the wine service. If we can convince him that his role in tonight's plan has already been discovered, he may be persuaded to name whoever hired him, particularly if it means avoiding the full weight of consequences himself." Together, Elinor and Edmund found Gerald near the cellar entrance, his composed expression faltering the moment he saw Peter Lang standing beside them, along with two guards who had clearly just come from restraining the men in the west drawing room. Alina watched the color drain slowly from Gerald's face as understanding dawned on him. "Your Grace, I can explain," he began, his voice unsteady. "You can," Alina said calmly, "or you can allow us to explain it for you, to the magistrate, along with everything we've already discovered about the debt you carried, the shipment that vanished from the registry 3 weeks ago, and the mechanism your men placed in our west drawing room tonight, designed to cause chaos among 300 guests, including a foreign delegation whose goodwill matters greatly to this kingdom's future." Gerald's shoulders sagged, the last of his composure crumbling entirely. "It was never meant to hurt anyone directly," he said quietly, "only to cause enough disruption, enough embarrassment that the trade agreement with Count Novik would collapse. I was promised the debt would be cleared, that my business would be spared if I simply provided access and materials. I never wanted this." "Who promised you this?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a duke who had, for the first time that evening, fully grasped the depth of the betrayal within his own household's trusted circle of merchants. Gerald hesitated only a moment before the name left his lips, confirming everything Alina had already suspected. With that confirmation in hand, spoken freely and without coercion, Alina understood that the final piece of proof needed to hold Lady Beatrice Fenwick fully accountable for the danger she had orchestrated was finally within their grasp, and that the grand ball, against every terrible possibility that had threatened it that evening, would end not in disaster, but in the quiet, decisive triumph of a Duchess no one had thought to take seriously until the moment it mattered most. Alina did not return to the ballroom immediately. Instead, she asked Peter to have Gerald's written confession, taken quickly by one of the household clerks summoned for the purpose, ready within the hour, along with a formal account from the young footman who had already confirmed the details of the plot. She wanted no room for doubt, no opportunity for Lady Beatrice to twist the truth into something smaller and more forgivable once confronted. When Alina finally made her way back toward the ballroom, the music still playing, the guests still laughing and dancing, entirely unaware of how close the evening had come to catastrophe, she felt a calm settle over her that surprised even herself. She had spent so many days carrying this burden alone, or nearly alone, that its resolution left her feeling both lighter and strangely hollow, the way a held breath feels once it is finally released. She found Edmund waiting near the edge of the dance floor, and together they approached Lady Beatrice, who stood near a group of guests discussing the evening's music with practiced enthusiasm. Edmund's expression, though carefully composed for the benefit of nearby guests, carried a weight that Beatrice noticed immediately, her own smile faltering just slightly as she took in the presence of Peter Lang standing a respectful distance behind them, along with two guards whose formal bearing did not match the relaxed atmosphere of the celebration around them. "Lady Beatrice," Edmund said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she, Alina, and the small circle immediately around them could hear. "Might we speak privately? There is a matter concerning tonight's wine service that requires your attention." It was a careful phrase, chosen deliberately to avoid alarming the wider room, but Alina watched the color drain slowly from Beatrice's face as she understood, in that instant, that whatever she had arranged had not unfolded as planned. She followed them without protest into a small study off the main corridor, her composure cracking visibly once the door closed behind them, and the noise of the ballroom faded into a distant hum. "I don't understand," Beatrice began, though her voice lacked the conviction to sustain the lie for long. "We found the device in the west drawing room," Alina said simply. "We stopped it before it could be triggered. Gerald Prout has already confirmed who arranged for its placement and why." Beatrice's shoulders sagged, the elegant composure she had carried through years of noble gatherings finally giving way to something rawer and more honest. "You don't understand what it's been like," she said, her voice trembling now. watching my family's fortune collapse while yours grew richer from the very agreement that ruined us. I never meant for anyone to be hurt. I only wanted the trade negotiations to fail, to buy my family time to pursue other arrangements before everything we had was gone entirely. Fire in a crowded ballroom does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, Edmund said, his voice quiet but firm. You endangered 300 lives tonight, Beatrice, including Count Novik and his delegation, whose trust our two nations depend upon. Whatever grievance you carried against my family, this was not the answer. Beatrice had no response to offer, and within the hour, with Gerald's written confession and the footman's corroborating account already secured, along with Peter's testimony regarding the device itself, the matter was placed formally into the hands of the magistrate who had been quietly summoned to the manor under the pretense of enjoying the evening's festivities as a guest. Lady Beatrice Fenwick was escorted from Ashcombe Manor before the night's final dance began, her absence explained to curious guests with a simple, believable story of sudden illness, a small mercy Alina insisted upon, understanding that the full truth would emerge in time through proper channels, without turning the evening itself into a spectacle that might unsettle the very guests they had worked so hard to protect. The ball continued long into the night, the orchestra playing until the early hours, guests dancing beneath chandeliers that had so nearly become instruments of disaster, entirely unaware of the danger that had passed so close to them. Alina moved through the remainder of the evening with a lightness she had not felt in days, finally free of the secret she had carried alone since her very first night at Ashcombe Manor. She danced with Edmund beneath the glittering lights, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the beauty of the celebration she had worked so hard to save. It was Count Aldrich Novik himself who approached her late in the evening, having heard, through channels Alina had not expected, a quiet and careful version of the night's true events, shared with him discreetly by Edmund out of respect for the delicate diplomatic relationship between their nations. The Count, a tall man with sharp eyes that missed little, bowed with genuine respect as he addressed her. "Your Grace," he said, "I understand this evening owes its safety, and perhaps the continued strength of the agreement between our two nations, to your quiet vigilance. I confess, when I first met you at dinner earlier this week, I did not imagine the Duchess of Ravensworth to be a woman capable of such careful thinking." Alina smiled, the same gentle smile she had worn since her arrival, though something steadier now lived behind it. "I've found that people rarely imagine what a quiet person is capable of, Count Novik. I've learned not to mind the assumption. It has served me well." The following morning, word of the true events of the grand ball began to spread through Ashcombe Manor, first among the staff, who had watched Alina's quiet habits over the past weeks with growing curiosity, and then, more carefully and deliberately, among the wider circle of nobility who had attended the celebration without any knowledge of how close disaster had come to unfolding around them. Margaret Doyle, the stern housekeeper who had once remarked on Alina's unusual interest in household ledgers, found Alina in the morning room reviewing correspondence and paused in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology, Your Grace," Margaret said. "I mistook your quiet manner for simplicity. I see now that I was profoundly wrong." "You mistook it for what most people mistook it for," Alina said kindly. "I never minded, Margaret. It gave me the freedom to watch and listen without anyone paying close attention to what I noticed." Margaret nodded slowly, a new respect settling into her expression, one that would remain long after that morning, coloring every interaction between the two women for years to come. Alice, too, found herself regarded differently by the household staff once whispers of her role in uncovering the plot began to circulate, though Alina made certain, in the days that followed, that Alice's quick thinking and sharp eyes were formally recognized, securing for her a permanent position as Alina's personal assistant, a role that came with far greater respect and responsibility than the young woman had ever imagined possible when she first began folding linens in the manor's side rooms. Peter Lang, too, received recognition for his steady, capable handling of the crisis, promoted to head of household security, a position that placed him in charge of ensuring nothing of that nature ever threatened Ashcombe Manor again. Gerald Prout, having cooperated fully with the magistrate's investigation, and having genuinely believed, however wrongly, that his actions would not result in direct harm to anyone, received a lighter sentence than he might otherwise have faced, though his family's business was placed under strict oversight for years afterward, a consequence he accepted with quiet resignation. Lady Beatrice Fenwick's fate proved far more severe, her family's remaining standing among the nobility collapsing entirely once the full details of her scheme became known, a consequence that Eleanor, despite everything, could not find herself taking any satisfaction in, understanding all too well the desperation that had driven a woman to such dangerous extremes. In the weeks that followed the grand ball, Eleanor noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way the household and the wider nobility regarded her. Where once she had been greeted with polite but distant courtesy, an acknowledgement of her title rather than genuine respect for the woman who held it, she now found herself sought out for her opinion, her judgment trusted in matters both large and small. Edmund, too, found himself relying on her insight more openly, no longer simply as a supportive presence beside him, but as a genuine partner in managing the affairs of their household and their standing among the county's shifting political currents. One evening, several weeks after the ball, Eleanor sat with Edmund in the same study where she had first told him of the strange crates hidden in their wine cellar. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the manor around them had settled into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, the kind of peace that felt all the more precious for how close they had come to losing it. "I've been thinking," Edmund said, setting aside the letter he had been reading, "about how differently this household regarded you when you first arrived, and how differently they regard you now. I wonder if you ever resented it being so quickly dismissed." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, the way she considered most things. "I understood it," she said finally. "I arrived as a stranger, with none of the polish this world expects of a duchess. It was easier for people to assume I had little to offer than to wonder what might be happening quietly beneath the surface. I didn't resent it. I used it." "You'll have to teach me that patience someday," Edmund said with a small smile. "I confess I nearly gave myself away a dozen times over the past weeks, wanting to act the moment we suspected something was wrong." "Patience isn't about waiting quietly and doing nothing," Eleanor said. "It's about watching closely enough that, when the moment finally comes to act, you already know exactly what needs to be done." Outside, the evening settled peacefully over Ashcombe Manor, its halls quiet now, its dangers resolved, its future secured not through the loud, obvious strength that nobility so often prized, but through the quiet, careful vigilance of a woman the household had once dismissed without a second thought. Eleanor Whitmore had come to Ashcombe Manor as an outsider, underestimated by nearly everyone she met, and she had left that reputation behind not by proving herself loud enough to be noticed, but by proving herself steady enough to be trusted when it mattered most. In the months and years that followed, the story of the grand ball would be told and retold throughout the county, growing slightly with each retelling, but at its heart, the truth remained exactly as it had happened. The new Duchess, the one they thought was simply quiet, had saved them all, and she had done it exactly the way she did everything else, calmly, carefully, and without ever needing anyone's permission to be exactly as capable as she had always known herself to be.